Steve Smith is not the sexiest player to watch. He might end up as the second best test batter ever. But aesthetically, there are players who averaged half as much, who are far better on the eye, and sometimes because he bats so long, he puts the viewer to sleep after a while. And this is funny because Steve Smith owns his own mattress company. In fact, he's made millions off that investment. But the other thing that makes this all the more ridiculous is that Steve Smith doesn't sleep during tests. This has obviously become a big issue for him because now we can have a look at his average splits. For generations, people barely ever knew this kind of information. But on the left here, we have his overall mark, which is the second best of all time. Next to that, you have the first innings, which is just a stupid mark. But he never reaches that again. And it is the consistency of the downward spiral that is almost hypnotic here. In fact, let's just take his overall mark off for a second. This is basically a slide that Smith slips down until he ends up in bed. In case you're wondering, this is not normal. It's a very weird trend. And so because Smith doesn't sleep during tests, the thought is that these two things are related. During a test match, the only thing that Smith sleeps through is the fourth innings. There is a really in-depth Reddit piece on this from a few years ago by Inside Out Over Cover. And it goes a lot further than just looking at his average. It gives us numbers on the hours of sleep that Smith likely misses based on the man's own words. These numbers are just approximations. But we know that 8 hours a day is about right when it comes to sleep, and Smith thinks he gets less than half of that. So over an entire test, it is an awful lot of time for anyone not to be sleeping properly, especially someone who is supposed to be performing high athletic feats against tiny red projectiles aimed at their face. And we know that Smith has used sleeping pills before, but as someone who was once prescribed them, they don't always work or make you feel any better. Sleep for professional athletes over the last couple of years has become a major part of the sport. More than a decade ago, the NBA and NHL started employing sleep doctors. Other sports have flirted with it as well. From what I could tell, no one in cricket has a sleep doctor on their books. In fact, I asked a few teams and they were shocked this was even a thing. Though I'm sure it's happened in individual cases, and I would assume by now that Australia has probably hired one for Smith. And most likely that it didn't work.
I know that you think you could run your favourite cricket team better than those who do, but no one is going to let you do that. So why not try Wicket Cricket Manager to satisfy that urge? Pick your nation, pick your league, pick your players, and yell at them when they do poorly. You can find it in the links below or by searching for Wicket Cricket Manager in your app store today.
Whether or not this is the main reason for him struggling in the fourth innings doesn't actually matter. It clearly can't be helping him on the field. But let's start at what Smith is good at. He is, by a large distance, the second best batter ever when a test match starts. Smith is 10 up on third place, and that is Everton Weekes at 76. Smith's number of 86 would be Bradman-esque, if not for the little fella himself with the 113 mark. I think if you watch Smith bat, the first innings makes the most sense for him. Partly because he is rested, but mostly because the bounce is at its highest and most consistent, and crucially he's not a context batter in the way that someone like Ben Stokes is. At the top, the job is simply to make as many runs as possible. This is the least amount of context required for batting, and only one human has ever done it better than Smith. By the second innings, he is back in the pack. Now, it's worth saying that he's still averaging over 50 at this point, so it's a pretty tasty pack. But his average drops 30 runs from the first innings. It's hard to ignore that. It's also worth noting here that Bradman has slipped, not to a mortal level, he's still looking down on everyone, but there is certainly some slippage here. And I mention that at least partly because once we get to the third innings, Bradman is back to dominating all the worlds again. But Smith is not. I don't think he's that much worse than the second, especially considering this is a lower scoring innings altogether for all of cricket. So even though he does average 12 less, there is probably a natural dip included in that as well. Of course, the fourth is something else entirely. It is not even worth looking at Smith first. Let's start with the fact that no player has ever made 2,000 runs in the fourth innings or even close. Sachin tops this list at just below 1,700, and you can see that Smith is a long way away from that. Now, averaging under 30 will do that, but Sachin was also not a great fourth innings batter, but he did play a lot of innings. Steve Smith does not bat in the fourth innings that much. Australia's batted first a huge amount of times in his matches, and so even the second innings is not something he's seen a lot of. So small sample size does come into the equation with him. It is only 24 innings, but it's still not nothing. But quite clearly he makes a lot of runs at the start of the game in terms of average and totals, and then after that the second innings is the only one where his batting holds up for the amount of runs he's made compared to the amount of innings he's had. But let's just focus on the fourth innings. 14% of his innings are played there, and yet he makes less than 7% of his runs from that. That's a massive discrepancy. Even allowing for some not outs and chases, of which he has 3, he should have just made more runs batting in the 4th innings. So let's have a look at the average for that. Bradman drops all the way to 3rd here. Not that he isn't good, but partly because the 500 run limit does change things a little. It means that South Africa's Bruce Mitchell goes to number 1. In 12 innings, he scored 629 runs with 5 not outs. And so the not outs certainly play a part here. But even if he was dismissed every single time, Mitchell still would have averaged over 50 in the 4th innings. He was an absolute warrior in what was a terribly ordinary period of South African cricket. His test career spanned 22 years on either side of World War I, and he destroyed England bowling attacks for fun and ended his career with an average of 49. If he played in a better era for South African cricket, he would have had a much greater reputation. But you know why I'm showing you this. Because Mitchell is the anti-Smith. We don't know how good he was in the 4th innings, as he probably didn't play enough altogether. But it certainly looks like he was at his best there. Most of the best batters in the 4th innings are openers. Mitchell, to be fair, batted almost in every position because he went wherever South Africa needed him. But Hobbs, Greenwich, Boycott, Gavaskar all loved the 4th innings. And that's probably partly because of the high portion of not-outs in low chases. These men knew how to boost their records, and they were good enough to do it. Smith is obviously not an opener. And he's also not doing well. But to show you just how much he struggles here, let's do this. The person ahead of him on this list is Jason Holder. Sure, he can hold a bat, but how many times do you think his batting would ever be compared to the level of Stephen Smith? This is clearly a problem. It is hard to see him this low on any list and think it is in any way right or normal. And let's say sleep plays a part, which I suppose should make some sense. But is that really all it is? We know batting in general gets harder as the match goes on. But clearly Smith's graph is falling so much worse than it should be. So I wondered, what other players get tired? Keepers get tired. They are involved in more balls per match than any other cricketer. And yet their drop-off when batting is similar. And nothing like Smith's at all. Now, my first thought was maybe normal cricket tired is perhaps different to not sleeping tired. But then I thought, what about keepers in the top 6? Because not all of these players are the same. So what if we split them up by top 6 keepers and keepers who batted 7 to 11? Because if you are a wicket keeper and you bat in the top order, you are doing by far the most work of anyone in that game. You're essentially almost a double specialist, a full-time all-rounder. And you can see what happens. Specialist keepers have a nice normal decline in their records, and keeper batters can barely hold their bat by the end of the game. All the runs your top 6 keepers are giving you comes in those first 3 innings, and by the end, they're no better than a specialist wicketkeeper with the bat. Obviously, this pattern is not as stark as Smith, but it is a quite consistent drop-off that really tails off at the end. And in the top order wicketkeepers and Smith's case, it's the tail that is the most important. It would be hard to argue that both the hard-working keepers and the barely sleeping Smith get tired and it affects their game. And when you look at how many runs various players drop off from the first innings to the last, that is when you see that a normal top 6 batter will lose about 25% of their runs. Keepers are well over a third, but Smith is over 2/3. So tiredness clearly matters. But that isn't the only thing that Smith does that most people don't do at this level. He's one of the few batters ever to play across the line frequently and successfully. And doing that early on when the pitch is bouncing consistently is very different than doing it at the end of the game when you get more variable bounce. The problem is, I wasn't exactly sure how to work this out. So I thought maybe his LBW percentage would be the best way, as bowled might include drag-ons. And in the first 2 innings, his dismissal rate is less than normal to LBW, which is scandalous, being that he plays everything across the line. But in the last 2 innings, he's dismissed more than other players' leg before. The most notable curve is in the 4th innings. Now, I'm not sure how scientific this is, and the differences aren't that huge. But this does make sense, even if again it doesn't account for all of his loss of form. But of course, Smith is one of a few players over the history of the game to play across the line. So I went and looked at the most successful players who did it a lot. None have Smith's problem in the 4th innings. Though what I would say is that Smith is a little different to them. Most of this lot dragged the ball from outside off to leg. Smith turned off stump into leg stump. And no one has ever done it like him before. He's truly a one of one. But while I was thinking about all this, I started wondering if there are any batters who share his pattern. So the easiest place to start was this big 4 group. And quite obviously, none have a pattern even remotely like Smith. In fact, outside of Virat's 3rd innings drop and what happens in the opening innings, all of these players make more runs throughout the rest of the game than Smith does. And I just wanted to add Babar Azam as well, just because while he doesn't quite fit the age profile, he certainly does on talent. And he is not great in the last innings, but he still averages 8 more than Smith. And honestly, his curve looks a lot more like Root's. So when you put Smith among his contemporaries, he still looks pretty unique. However, I kept digging around to see if there are any other batters who shared this Smith-like trend. And I found a bunch. Everton Weekes was my favourite, because outside of a strong second innings, his pattern was almost exactly the same as Smith. He even managed to average less than him in the fourth. As Ali's pattern is different, but in the fourth innings again, he was lower than Smith. And then there is Brian Lara, who averages 6 more in the fourth innings, but he's another high first innings, low fourth kind of guy. And unlike Weekes and Azhar, Lara is an all-time great with a long career like Smith. There are also just a bunch of others that may not share the exact first innings to last innings batting slip of Smith, but they're pretty good throughout the first 3 innings and then they lose it all towards the end. In fact, other than Marcus Trescothick, they all bat fine in the first 2 innings and then don't make many runs in the last 2. Dennis Compton is almost identical to Smith, just without the first innings boost. It's also worth pointing out that when I looked at all the different strugglers in the fourth innings, I found top and middle order players, Asian players, centre players. If there was a pattern here, I couldn't find it. And the last 2 lists were the only players I found, because I also found a lot of Australians, far more than I ever imagined. Some of these are just fourth inning strugglers like Khawaja and Border. If we take them out, we're left with 4 players with, again, similar trends to Smith. Colin McDonald is not that famous, but he was a fine opener, and you can see he was incredible in the first 2 innings, and then afterwards, not so much. The next one shocked me because it was Michael Clarke. When he played, everyone talked about all his weaknesses, and I don't really remember that many people talk about the fact that he was worse as the match went on. But I think the most obvious one here is another Steve, Waugh. This is uncanny. Waugh doesn't quite have the first innings like Smith, but in the first 2 innings, he is a star, and from then on, it all fell apart from him. Even worse than Smith. So my first question is, with him, or McDonald, or Weekes, or Azhar, or Lara, is, did they not sleep during test matches as well? Because the more I looked, the more players I found who were very good in the first innings of test matches and not particularly good in the second. So it is getting a lot harder to believe that sleep is the major factor here. However, I thought it was worth looking at least one player we knew of who didn't sleep much during test matches. It should be pointed out that while Smith was up all night thinking about the rest of the game, Botham was probably drinking and, whatever else he could do after midnight. If you put Don't Tell Kath, which is the name of his wife, in your autobiography, clearly he was doing things after dark that he should not have been doing. Now, obviously, Botham wasn't the level of batter of Smith, but when you look at his overall record, he has a similar first innings to last drop, even if it's not as extreme. And he scores a little bit more steady in innings 2 and 3. But this does look like tiredness caught up to Botham during games. But there's an even better way of checking this with Botham. Because he's an all-rounder, we can actually check his record with the ball as well. And when you look at this, it is very clear that in the first 3 innings, he was a way above average bowler. And then in the fourth innings, just like his batting, he falls off a cliff. So with the bat and ball, Botham was a fantastic player for 3 innings. And then in the last one, his lifestyle was killing his game completely. And I'm more confident in saying that because we have his batting and bowling. This isn't just a technical problem that he doesn't like the end of matches with the bat. He should like the end of matches with the ball. But it is remarkable that for 3 innings, his record is fairly flat, and then at the end, it just falls off that cliff. That isn't Smith. He gets worse every single innings, like he is degrading in the same way that the cricket pitch is itself. With Smith, I certainly think that sleep matters, but I don't think you can discount the fact that the first innings makes the most sense for how he bats, and each subsequent innings suits his peculiar batting personality a little bit less. He also does play across the line. He should be struggling more in the last innings because of that. But finally, we also just have to admit that the truth is that many players don't make runs at the end of the game. It is a tricky innings, and he is certainly not alone. Though like he is for most things, Steve Smith might be the most extreme version of that trend.